I never thought I would witness the complete collapse of everything we had been taught to believe was invincible. My name is Oberst Heinrich Steiner, and in the winter of 1942, I was a 43-year-old colonel in the Wehrmacht, commanding a regiment of the 6th Army trapped in the frozen hell of Stalingrad. I had served Germany for 25 years, fought in the Great War as a young lieutenant, survived the chaos of the Weimar Republic, and watched with cautious optimism as the new regime rebuilt our military into what we were told was the most powerful fighting force in history. We had conquered Poland in weeks, swept through France in months, and driven deep into the Soviet Union with what seemed like unstoppable momentum. Our commanders spoke confidently of final victory, of the inevitable triumph of German arms and discipline over the inferior forces of our enemies. But standing in the ruins of Stalingrad that December, watching my men freeze and starve while Soviet forces tightened their encirclement, I began to understand a terrible truth that would become the Wehrmacht's greatest humiliation. We had been lied to about everything, and the reality of our situation was so much worse than any of us had been willing to admit. The morning of November 23, 1942, started with the news that shattered whatever illusions we still held. Soviet forces had completed their encirclement of Stalingrad, trapping the entire 6th Army, nearly 300,000 men, in a pocket with no relief force in sight, and winter closing in with brutal intensity. The temperature had dropped to 20 degrees below 0 Celsius, and we were desperately short of food, ammunition, fuel, and medical supplies. But what made the situation truly catastrophic wasn't just the tactical encirclement. It was the growing realization among those of us who were willing to see clearly that our entire strategic position was based on lies, delusions, and a fundamental misunderstanding of the war we were fighting. I had joined the German army in 1917, during the final desperate year of the Great War. I was 18 years old, full of patriotic fervor, convinced that Germany's cause was just and that victory was still possible if we just fought hard enough. The reality of trench warfare on the Western Front had been my first encounter with the gap between what leaders claimed and what soldiers experienced. I'd watched men die by the thousands for gains measured in meters, seen the utter futility of tactics that hadn't evolved to match modern weapons, and experienced the bitter defeat of 1918 when everything we'd been promised turned to ash. The years between the wars had been difficult for professional soldiers like myself. The Treaty of Versailles had reduced the German army to a shadow of its former self, limited to 100,000 men, forbidden modern weapons, stripped of its pride and purpose. I'd stayed in uniform when many of my comrades left for civilian life, partly because I knew nothing else, partly because I believed Germany deserved better than the humiliation imposed by the victors. When the new regime came to power in 1933 and began rebuilding the military, I'd been cautiously supportive. We were soldiers, not politicians. We served Germany, whoever led it. The early victories had been intoxicating. Poland fell in weeks, a testament to the new tactics of combined arms warfare we called blitzkrieg. France, which had cost us millions of casualties in 4 years of fighting during the Great War, collapsed in 6 weeks. Yugoslavia, Greece, North Africa, all fell before German arms. We were told we were invincible, that our training and equipment and tactical doctrine were superior to anything our enemies could field. And for a while, the evidence seemed to support those claims. The invasion of the Soviet Union in June 1941 had been presented as the final campaign, the war that would decide everything. We were told the Soviet Union was a decrepit state, propped up by communist lies, that its army was poorly led and equipped, that it would collapse within months under the weight of German military superiority. Operation Barbarossa began with stunning successes. We advanced hundreds of kilometers, captured millions of prisoners, destroyed thousands of enemy tanks and aircraft. Moscow seemed within reach. But even in those early months, there were warning signs that some of us noticed but didn't want to acknowledge. The Soviet Union was vast beyond anything we'd experienced in Western Europe. The roads were terrible or non-existent. The railways used a different gauge than European lines, requiring massive logistical efforts to maintain supply. The Red Army, despite horrendous losses, kept fighting with a tenacity that surprised us. And most ominously, the weather was becoming a factor that no amount of tactical brilliance could overcome. By the winter of 1941, the advance had stalled outside Moscow. The temperature dropped to 40 degrees below zero, and our equipment, designed for European campaigns, began to fail catastrophically. Tanks wouldn't start, weapons froze, men suffered frostbite by the thousands. The Soviet counteroffensive that winter drove us back from Moscow's outskirts and cost us tens of thousands of casualties. But the High Command refused to acknowledge what that meant strategically. Instead, they blamed the weather, claimed we'd been on the verge of victory, insisted that the next summer's offensive would finish what we'd started. The 1942 summer offensive, Case Blue, was supposed to be decisive. We would drive south, capture the Caucasus oil fields that Germany desperately needed, cut Soviet supply lines, and force a strategic collapse. My regiment was part of the 6th Army under General Paulus, tasked with capturing Stalingrad, a major industrial city on the Volga River. Taking Stalingrad would secure our flank, cut a critical transportation route, and deliver a psychological blow by capturing a city that bore Stalin's name. We entered Stalingrad in September 1942, expecting another quick victory. Instead, we encountered urban warfare of an intensity none of us had experienced. The Soviets defended every building, every floor, every room. Combat was measured in meters, sometimes in individual rooms of ruined buildings. The neat tactical doctrines we'd relied on meant nothing in the chaos of close quarters, fighting among rubble and ruins. Casualties mounted horrifically on both sides. I remember September turning into October, watching the faces of my men change as the reality of Stalingrad set in. These were hardened soldiers, veterans of campaigns across Europe and into Russia, men who'd seen combat and death and maintained their discipline and fighting spirit. But Stalingrad was different. Lieutenant Karl Hoffmann, one of my company commanders, described it best during a brief respite in a shattered basement that had once been someone's home. "Colonel, I fought in Poland, France, and Russia," Hoffmann said, his uniform filthy with brick dust and dried blood. "But this is something else entirely. We take a building floor by floor, room by room, losing men every step of the way. And the next day, the Soviets counterattack and we have to do it all over again. We're fighting for individual staircases, for single walls. The factory district is like some kind of industrial hell where you can't tell friend from enemy until you're close enough to kill each other. How do we win a war like this?" I had no answer for him, because the truth was that we weren't winning. We were grinding ourselves down in an attritional battle that favored the defenders, in a city that had become a meat grinder consuming both armies. But we kept fighting because we believed in German military superiority, because our commanders told us victory was close, because admitting we might be in an unwinnable situation was unthinkable. And then came November 19th, when Soviet forces launched Operation Uranus, a massive pincer movement that swept past our Romanian allies on the flanks and closed the trap around Stalingrad. By November 23rd, we were completely encircled. The immediate reaction from the High Command was denial. Field Marshal von Manstein would break through the encirclement, we were told. The Luftwaffe would supply us by air, delivering 500 tons of supplies daily to sustain the army until relief arrived. We should hold our positions, fight on, trust in German military prowess and organization to solve the problem. Retreat was never mentioned as an option, despite the fact that breaking out immediately before the Soviet ring solidified might have saved most of the army. I remember the meeting where our division commander, General Major Klaus Weber, briefed us on the situation. Weber was 52 years old, a career officer from an old Prussian military family, decorated veteran of the Great War, everything a German general was supposed to be. He stood before us in a ruined factory building that served as division headquarters, the temperature well below freezing, and delivered the High Command's assessment with complete confidence. "Gentlemen, our situation is serious but manageable," Weber said, his breath visible in the frigid air. "The encirclement is temporary. Field Marshal von Manstein is organizing a relief force that will break through within weeks. The Luftwaffe has guaranteed adequate supply by air. Our task is to hold Stalingrad, maintain combat effectiveness, and prepare to link up with the relief force when it arrives. German soldiers have faced difficult situations before and always prevailed through discipline, courage, and superior training." I wanted to believe him. God knows I wanted to believe that the system we'd trusted, the commanders we'd followed, the institution we'd served had a solution to this catastrophe. But I'd been a soldier too long, seen too much, understood logistics and tactics too well to accept those reassurances at face value. "Sir, with respect," I said, choosing my words carefully because questioning orders could have serious consequences. "The Luftwaffe would need to deliver 500 tons of supplies daily to sustain 300,000 men. That requires hundreds of transport flights per day, in winter weather, against Soviet air defenses that are growing stronger. And even if von Manstein assembles a relief force, he'll have to fight through strengthening Soviet positions across 100 kilometers of winter terrain. The timeline seems optimistic. Weber's expression hardened. Colonel Steiner, your concerns are noted, but the High Command has access to information and expertise that we don't have at our level. Our duty is to follow orders, maintain discipline, and have faith in German military capability. Defeatist talk helps no one and undermines morale. Is that clear? Yes, sir, I replied, but the seed of doubt had been planted not just in my mind, but in the minds of every officer in that room. We'd all done the calculations. We all knew what the logistics required, and we were all beginning to suspect that what we were being told bore little resemblance to reality. The Luftwaffe tried heroically to supply us, but the effort was doomed from the start. Transport planes flew through terrible weather and increasingly effective Soviet air defenses. On good days, they delivered perhaps 100 tons of supplies. On bad days, which were most days, they delivered far less or nothing at all. We needed 500 tons daily just to survive, let alone maintain combat capability. The math was simple and brutal. We were starving, freezing, and running out of ammunition while being told that everything was under control. The pilots themselves showed remarkable courage. I watched them land on makeshift airstrips under artillery fire, unload whatever supplies they'd managed to bring, and take off again through a gauntlet of anti-aircraft fire and Soviet fighters. Many didn't make it. The wrecks of transport aircraft littered the approaches to our perimeter, twisted metal monuments to a logistical impossibility that we'd been ordered to believe in anyway. Captain Ernst Bauer, one of our supply officers, kept meticulous records of what we received versus what we needed. In early December, he showed me his ledger with a look of complete despair. Colonel, look at these numbers. On our best day this week, we received 94 tons of supplies. We need 500. Yesterday we received 37 tons. The day before, 18. We're not getting a fifth of what we need. The horses are gone, eaten weeks ago. We're burning furniture and wooden beams for heat. The men are on quarter rations and still losing weight rapidly. The wounded are dying because we have no medical supplies. And headquarters keeps telling us that adequate supply is being maintained. I looked at his carefully documented figures. The gap between promise and reality laid out in stark numbers that couldn't be denied or explained away. Keep these records, Ernst, I told him. Someday, when people ask what happened here, these numbers will tell the truth better than any official report. By early December, the reality was impossible to ignore. Men were dying of hunger and cold as much as from enemy action. We were butchering our horses for meat, burning furniture and wooden structures for heat, rationing ammunition so severely that some units couldn't respond effectively to Soviet attacks. The promised relief force had launched its operation, but Soviet resistance was fiercer than expected, and von Manstein's advance had stalled 50 kilometers short of our perimeter. What made it worse, what transformed military disaster into profound humiliation, was the growing realization that this catastrophe was entirely avoidable and resulted directly from decisions made at the highest levels based on delusion, arrogance, and refusal to face reality. Hitler had personally ordered us to hold Stalingrad at all costs, refusing to authorize a breakout when it might have succeeded. The High Command had assured us the Luftwaffe could supply an encircled army, despite never having accomplished anything remotely similar in scale. Field Marshal Goering had personally guaranteed the airlift, apparently believing his own propaganda about Luftwaffe capabilities more than the mathematical reality of logistics. And all of this, all of the lies and delusions and catastrophic decisions, stemmed from a fundamental misunderstanding that I was finally beginning to articulate. We had believed our own propaganda. We had convinced ourselves that German military superiority was so overwhelming that normal rules didn't apply to us. We had assumed that will and courage and tactical brilliance could overcome material reality. We had trusted leaders who made strategic decisions based on ideology and wishful thinking, rather than honest assessment of capabilities and limitations. I watched this realization spread through the officer corps like a slow poison. We couldn't say it out loud, couldn't acknowledge it in official communications, but in quiet conversations in frozen bunkers, in the eyes of men who'd followed orders their entire careers, you could see the understanding dawning. We had been betrayed not by our enemies, but by our own leadership's refusal to accept reality. Major Franz Richter, one of my battalion commanders, expressed it most clearly one night in late December. Richter was 35 years old, had fought in Poland and France and the early campaigns in Russia, was as dedicated a soldier as I'd ever known. We were sharing a tiny amount of watery soup that barely qualified as food, huddled around a small fire in the basement of a ruined building, when he spoke what we were all thinking. "Colonel, I've followed every order I've been given," Richter said, his voice quiet and hollow. "I've led my men into impossible situations because I trusted that the High Command knew what they were doing, that there was a plan, that our sacrifices served a larger strategic purpose. But this isn't strategy. This isn't tactics. This is murder. They've trapped us here, lied to us about relief and supply, and are letting us die rather than admit they made a mistake. That's not military leadership. That's criminal incompetence driven by ego and delusion." I couldn't disagree because he was absolutely right. The humiliation wasn't just that we were trapped and dying. The humiliation was that we'd been led here by commanders who'd prioritized propaganda over reality, who'd made decisions based on what they wanted to be true, rather than what was actually true, who'd sacrificed an entire army rather than admit error. The breakdown of discipline and morale that followed was something I'd never witnessed in my entire military career. German soldiers had always been known for maintaining order and fighting effectiveness, even in desperate situations. But there are limits to what human beings can endure when they realize they've been abandoned by their own leadership. By mid-December, we were seeing increasing incidents of soldiers simply giving up, refusing to fight, abandoning positions not out of cowardice, but out of complete physical and psychological exhaustion, combined with the understanding that their suffering served no purpose. I had to execute 2 soldiers in late December for desertion, something that still haunts me. They were young men, barely 20 years old, who'd tried to walk out of the pocket towards Soviet lines to surrender. We caught them before they made it through our own perimeter. Military law was clear. Desertion in the face of the enemy carried the death penalty. But looking at those boys, hollow-eyed and skeletal from hunger, I knew they weren't cowards. They were just broken by a situation that shouldn't have existed, victims of leadership failures far above their level. Christmas 1942 in Stalingrad was the bleakest day of my life. We tried to maintain some semblance of tradition, gathering what remained of the regiment in a partially intact church basement. Someone had scrounged a small pine branch to serve as a Christmas tree. We had no food for a proper meal, no gifts to exchange, no real hope left to sustain us. But we sang the old hymns, and for a few moments, we tried to remember what we were supposed to be fighting for. Chaplain Michael Weiss, who'd been with the regiment since Poland, gave a brief sermon that night. Weiss was in his 50s, had served in the Great War as a young chaplain, and had seen more death and suffering than any priest should have to witness. His words were careful, walking a fine line between maintaining morale and acknowledging reality. "My brothers, we stand in a dark place tonight," Weiss said, his voice echoing in the cold basement. "We are far from home, surrounded by enemies, short of all material necessities, but we are not abandoned by God, even if we may feel abandoned by men. Whatever happens in the days ahead, remember that your courage and sacrifice have meaning beyond the immediate tactical situation. You have done your duty, you have fought with honor, and that cannot be taken from you, regardless of what else is lost." It was the closest anyone in an official capacity came to acknowledging what we all knew, that we had been abandoned, that our sacrifice served no strategic purpose, that we were dying for the egos of leaders who couldn't admit their mistakes. The Soviet final offensive began in January 1943. They systematically reduced our perimeter, capturing position after position as we fell back with diminishing ability to resist. By late January, the situation was beyond desperate. We were out of food, nearly out of ammunition, had thousands of wounded with no medical supplies to treat them. Men were literally freezing to death at their positions. Units were surrendering not because they lacked courage, but because they physically couldn't fight anymore. On January 31, 1943, General Paulus surrendered the southern pocket of the 6th Army. The northern pocket held out for another 2 days before capitulating. Of the nearly 300,000 German and Allied soldiers encircled at Stalingrad, approximately 90,000 survived to enter Soviet captivity. Most would not survive that captivity. The 6th Army, one of Germany's premier formations, had been completely destroyed not through enemy military superiority, but through leadership decisions that defied basic military logic. I was among those who surrendered. Standing in the frozen ruins of Stalingrad, watching Soviet soldiers round up the survivors, I felt not just the pain of defeat, but the profound humiliation of understanding how completely we'd been failed by our own leadership. We hadn't been beaten by superior Soviet tactics or equipment or soldiers. We'd been beaten by our own commanders' refusal to accept reality, to acknowledge limits, to prioritize soldiers' lives over ego and ideology. The years in Soviet captivity were brutal, and most of my comrades didn't survive them. I was among the lucky ones who eventually returned to Germany in 1949, to a country divided and shattered, to a society trying to understand what had happened and why. The questions about Stalingrad, about how Germany's military could have suffered such a catastrophic defeat, were part of larger questions about how an entire nation had been led into disaster by leaders who believed their own propaganda more than reality. In the decades since, as a historian analyzing that period, I've come to understand that Stalingrad wasn't an aberration. It was the logical result of a military culture that had lost its moorings, that had abandoned the careful professional judgment that should guide military operations in favor of ideological certitude and leader worship. The Wehrmacht's humiliation at Stalingrad stemmed from the gap between what we claimed to be and what we actually were, between the propaganda of invincibility and the reality of an army led by men who made decisions based on fantasy rather than fact. The German military had genuine strengths: well-trained soldiers, effective small unit tactics, experienced junior officers and NCOs. But those strengths were squandered by strategic leadership that didn't understand or didn't care about logistics, that refused to acknowledge when situations were untenable, that prioritized propaganda victories over military reality, and that treated soldiers' lives as expendable resources in service of leaders' egos and ideological commitments. That was the reality that became Hitler's commanders' worst humiliation. Not that we lost, but that we lost so completely and unnecessarily, sacrificed so many lives in service of delusions, and did so while claiming to represent the pinnacle of military professionalism and capability. The gap between what we claimed to be and what we actually were became impossible to ignore at Stalingrad, and that recognition was more humiliating than any battlefield defeat could ever be. I'm 94 years old now, one of the last survivors of that catastrophe. I've spent the last decades of my life trying to ensure that future generations understand not just what happened at Stalingrad, but why it happened. The lesson isn't about tactics or equipment or even strategic planning. The lesson is about the fundamental importance of leaders who are willing to face reality, acknowledge limitations, admit mistakes, and prioritize the lives of those they command over their own egos and ideological commitments. When military leadership loses that grounding, when commanders begin to believe their own propaganda and make decisions based on what they want to be true rather than what is true, catastrophe inevitably follows. Stalingrad was that catastrophe made manifest, and its lessons remain relevant for any military, any organization, any society that must balance confidence with humility, determination with realism, and courage with honest acknowledgement of limitations. That is what I learned in the frozen ruins of Stalingrad, that the greatest military disaster isn't losing a battle, it's losing touch with reality. And that lesson, purchased with hundreds of thousands of lives, must never be forgotten.